Welcome to this session. My name is Barbara Gochalia, and today we are going to look at the theory of externalities and the environment. The theory of externalities and the environment. Now, before we even look at or get to know what externalities are, we need to know how these externalities arise. What causes these externalities and what are these externalities? So this is the chapter overview. We shall be looking at market failure. Market failure as a failure to allocate resources efficiently, the meaning of externalities, negative externalities of production and consumption. We shall be looking at positive externalities of production and consumption. We shall look at public goods. We shall look at common access resources and the threat to sustainability. Then we shall look at asymmetric information and abuse of monopoly power or imperfect market structures. Now, before we look at externalities and the environment, it is good for us to first know what causes these externalities. Now, an externality is a market failure. And what is market failure? Now, when we talk about a market, we basically talk about goods and services, and we talk about sellers and buyers, right? So a market comprises of sellers and buyers, it comprises of goods and services, and it involves exchange, right? Exchange where the sellers are selling and in return, the buyers are paying them money for the goods and services offered. Now that is typical of a market. And when we talk about a market, we are basically talking about a perfectly competitive market. When we are looking at, in our microeconomics class, when we were looking at economic systems, we looked at 3 different kinds of economic systems, and we looked at the free market economy, we looked at the command economy or the centrally planned economy, and finally we looked at the mixed economy. Now, in this perspective, in this particular topic, when you talk about a market, we are basically talking about a free market or a perfectly competitive market. And this perfectly competitive market is also known as the laissez-faire market economy. And with this market economy, basically that we call laissez-faire or the free market economy, or simply a perfectly competitive market, in this kind of market, there is no government intervention. In other words, in this kind of market, the prices and output are determined by the forces of demand and supply, right? So that's what we mean by a free market economy. And laissez-faire is a French word that means leave it alone or let us alone, literally meaning that with this kind of market, there is no government intervention, given the fact that prices and output produced are determined by the forces of demand and supply. And it's only under this free market economy or the laissez-faire market economy that we attain what we call allocative efficiency. We attain what we call allocative efficiency. And with allocative efficiency in this kind of market, basically it means that we have an equilibrium where the demand, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. The quantity demanded of goods and services is equal to the quantity supplied. And at this point here, at that equilibrium, we shall be getting a corresponding price and a corresponding equilibrium price and a corresponding output or quantity, corresponding equilibrium price and the corresponding quantity, literally meaning that at that point there of equilibrium, we shall be attaining what we call optimal mix or optimal allocation of resources, or what we simply call allocative efficiency. So with allocative efficiency or optimal mix of resources, it means here in this kind of market, we are operating under an equilibrium. And with this equilibrium, it means that we have no excess and we have no shortage. Remember, below the equilibrium is a shortage, and above the equilibrium is a surplus, right? So what brings about the market failure? When we are not operating at this equilibrium here, and of course, when we are not at equilibrium, we know that the quantity demanded will be equal to the quantity supplied. Demand will be equal to the supply. And when we are not operating at this equilibrium, it means that the market has failed to allocate resources in a scenario where we have quantity demanded being greater than quantity supplied. In a scenario where we have quantity demanded being greater than quantity supplied, it means that in that kind of situation, we have a shortage. And in a scenario where we have quantity supplied greater than the quantity demanded, there it means we have a surplus. So if we have a surplus and if we have a shortage, it means we are not operating at an equilibrium, and it also means that we are not attaining optimal mix or optimal allocation of resources. And if we are not operating at an equilibrium, it means the market has failed, or we are experiencing what is called market failure. We are experiencing what is called market failure. Now, let us look at the sources. Let us look at the causes of market failure. The causes of market failure, and we shall be looking at the sources of the microeconomic market failure. We shall be looking at basically the microeconomic market failure. Now, market failure is caused by a number of factors. And these causes basically the existence of public goods, externalities that we are focusing on here, that we shall be really focusing on here, because we are looking at the theory of externalities and environment, but we cannot get to know externalities when we don't know what market failure is. So we shall look at the causes of market failure, and these: the existence of public goods. Externalities is also a market failure. Market power, or we can say imperfect market structures. When we have imperfect market structures, it means we are experiencing a market failure. Remember that the kind of market that we've been talking about, the free market economy or the laissez-faire, is basically what we call perfect competition. If you remember the market structures, is basically what we call perfect competition. And any market structure that is not perfect competition is called an imperfect market structure. So imperfect market structures here, we have what we call monopoly, we have what we call oligopoly, and we have what we call monopolistic competition. Any market structure that is not perfect competition is called an imperfect market structure. And here with imperfect market structures, we have monopoly, we have oligopoly, and we have monopolistic competition. So if we are having those market structures, it literally means that we are experiencing a market failure. Another cause of a market failure is what we call asymmetric information. Asymmetric information, or simply imperfect, or what you can call imperfect information. It can either be asymmetric information or imperfect information. All right. Then another cause of market failure is inequality, unequitable distribution, unequitable distribution of resources. And then another cause of market failure is the existence of the common access resources. The existence of the common access resources. Now, let us look at, I want us to begin with what we mean by an externality. I want us to look at what we mean by an externality. And by definition, an externality is either a benefit or cost of market transaction. An externality is either a benefit or cost of market transaction that is not reflected in the price of a commodity. In other words, an externality occurs to a third party who is not involved in the market. An externality occurs to a third party who is not involved in the market. So if it is a benefit of market transaction, it becomes a positive externality. And if it is a cost of market transaction, it becomes a negative externality. And it can either be an externality in production or an externality in consumption, right? It can either be an externality in production or an externality in consumption. Now, let us look at a negative externality of production. A negative externality of production. Now, like we've already seen, that a negative externality, if it is a negative externality, it is a cost. It is a cost of market transaction that is not reflected in the price of a commodity. That is not reflected in the price of a commodity, and it occurs to a third party who is not part of the market transaction. Now, to help us understand what we really mean by a negative externality of production, we can maybe get an example. We can get an example. For example, a negative externality, an example of a negative externality in production is pollution. Pollution, right? We all know what you call pollution. It can either be air pollution or water pollution. But here, let us first look at air pollution. We are looking at air pollution, right? So let's imagine we are having a coal mining factory. We are having a coal mining factory, or any other, or a steel manufacturing plant, or a steel manufacturing plant, right? Or any other factory which during the process of production emits what we call greenhouse gas emission. Greenhouse gas emission, like carbon dioxide. During the process of production, this factory emits greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide in the air. It emits, for example, carbon dioxide in the air. That carbon dioxide brings the air pollution, right? So air pollution is an example of a negative externality of production, a polluting industry. Now we have key concepts here that we need to know. For example, we have what we call marginal private cost. Marginal private cost. Marginal private cost is the private cost of producing a good the private cost of producing a good. When the farm is producing that final product, it has to use, for example, raw materials, it has to employ labor. So all that, the inputs in the production process, is the private cost of producing that good, and we call it marginal product, marginal private cost, marginal private. We have marginal social cost. Then we have marginal social cost, which is the cost to society of producing the good, and it includes marginal private cost plus the external cost. Now, the cost to society here, we are looking at this coal mining factory that is emitting the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But of course, the nearby community, the people at the vicinity of this factory are inhaling this carbon dioxide, these greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, at the end of the day, in the long run, as they continue inhaling in these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, they may end up getting lung diseases in the long run. So that cost, that inconvenience of these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide is what we call the marginal social cost. And the marginal social cost will be the marginal private cost plus the external costs plus any external costs. Then we have the actual output in the market that is represented by QE, that I will be explaining later on. Then we have the socially optimal output in the market that is represented by QS naught. Then we have the equilibrium price in the market that is represented by PE, and we have the socially optimal price, or the socially optimal price, yeah, which is represented by PS naught, which is represented by PS naught. Now, having known the meaning of all those concepts, we now look at the graphical illustration of a negative externality of production, or what we simply call a curve explaining the negative externality of production. Now, important for us to know is that when we are drawing, I want to give you a simple logic of drawing these curves, a simple logic of drawing these curves for externalities. Now, we shall have two kind of curves. We shall have a curve which is the supply curve, right? And we shall have a curve which is the demand curve, right? I believe we all know the supply curve and the demand curve. We've done some economics, some microeconomics. So the supply curve will be representing the cost. The supply curve will be representing the cost, and the demand curve will be representing the benefit. The demand curve will be representing the benefit. The demand curve will be representing the benefit, right? Remember, we've seen that an externality is either a benefit or a cost of market transaction that is not reflected in the price of a good, that is not reflected in the price of a commodity, but it happens to a third party who is not part of the market transaction. Now, if it is an externality in production, we are going to have, if it's an externality in production, we are going to have an externality in production. An externality, remember that an externality is a cost. A negative externality is a cost, whereas a positive externality is a benefit. Are we together? So a negative externality is a cost. So if it is in production and it is a cost of market transaction, we are going to have two supply curves. We are going to have two supply curves. Remember, we've seen that the supply curve in this perspective is representing a cost, a cost of market transaction. So we are going to have, if it is an externality in production, if it's an externality in production, whether positive externality in production or negative externality in production, remember that an externality is a cost. So we are going to have two supply curves that are representing the cost, and then we shall have one demand curve. We shall have one demand curve which is representing, we shall have one demand curve which represents the benefit, Are we on the right track? And then we shall have here price here. We shall have price here, yeah, on the vertical axis, and we shall have output Q on the horizontal axis. Are we on the same page? Now, when it is an externality, when it is a negative externality in production, the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. When it is an externality, these are key important factors, key important elements that you need to know if you want to grasp the concept of externalities. If you want to grasp the concept of externalities. With the negative externality in production, with a negative externality of production, the marginal social cost, you should be writing down here, because some of these things you will not get them ready. They might be here, but not easy to identify. Maybe the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. The marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. We've already seen what marginal social cost and marginal private. These are key hints or tips. And then if it is above, if the marginal social cost is above the marginal private cost, it means the marginal social cost curve here will also be above the marginal private cost here, the marginal private cost here. In other words, what we mean by this is that with this, say, for example, a polluting industry, the people surrounding this area, the people in society, marginal social cost, people in the society near this factory that is emitting the carbon dioxide, for example, or the sulfur dioxide, they are suffering the inconvenience. And it is them that are suffering more than the factory, than the coal mining factory that is making money at the expense of their health, at the expense of them inhaling these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide. That's what it means. Now, having done that, we know that if this, the next thing we should know that at the point of equilibrium, the marginal social cost should be equal to, at equilibrium, the marginal social cost should be equal to the marginal social benefit. The marginal social benefit. At the point of equilibrium, the marginal social cost should be equal to the marginal social benefit. The marginal social cost should be equal to the marginal social benefit. When we say marginal social benefit, we mean the benefit, how would I call it now? The benefit, the good part, yeah, that the good thing that the society achieves. any good thing that the society achieves from this polluting industry. But of course, we know that it will not, society will not be benefiting the nearby community. They will not be benefiting because from this pollution. That's why we are saying that the marginal social cost, the inconvenience that they are suffering will be more than the benefit that they will be getting from this polluting factory, from this polluting factory. So if this was the marginal social cost, if this was the marginal social cost, and we've already seen that the demand curve represents the benefit. So this demand curve here will be the marginal social benefit. That demand curve there will be the marginal social benefit. And since we have already seen that at the point of equilibrium, the marginal social cost should be equal to the marginal social benefit, then we look at that point where we see that the marginal social cost, that red curve there, like the red curve in form of a supply curve, where it meets this blue curve, the marginal social benefit curve, will be a point of equilibrium, A point of equilibrium is always a point of intersection between the demand curve and the supply curve. And in this perspective, of course, we've seen that the demand curve is representing the benefit, marginal social benefit, and the supply curve is representing the marginal social cost. So that will be a point of equilibrium, or what we call a point of optimal efficiency, a point of optimal efficiency, or what we simply call optimal mix of resources, or what we call a point of allocative efficiency, optimal mix of resources, or a point of allocative efficiency. At that point, there the resources are allocated efficiently. So we shall have a corresponding equilibrium that is called the socially optimal price, the socially optimal price, PS note, and we shall have the socially optimal output. Of course, here, because we are looking at a polluting industry, it will be the socially optimal amount of pollution, Now, the next step we have to know is that, of course, now we have another equilibrium here. So if this one is equilibrium or not, this will be equilibrium prime, the second equilibrium there. Now, what does that equilibrium mean? That is second equilibrium. Of course, we see that at that equilibrium, the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal private cost. But at that equilibrium there, it is actually the actual amount of pollution, that is being emitted into the atmosphere, the actual amount of pollution that is being emitted into the atmosphere, which we can call probably QE, the actual amount of pollution emitted into the atmosphere. It could be carbon dioxide. Then it will have a corresponding output there, which is also a corresponding price there, which is also PE, which is the actual price that is charged, the actual price in the market, for the goods and services sold or produced by this polluting farm, right? Another important hint for us to note, we've already looked at two hints for us to help us while drawing these curves. So the third hint we need to know is that externalities. Externalities are always oversupplied. They are always oversupplied in the market. Negative externalities, actually, negative externalities. We know that we should know that negative externalities are always oversupplied or over allocated in the market. Negative externalities, they are always oversupplied in the market or over allocated in the market. So now I hope now we know how we've come, how this diagram comes about. I've explained how we get this diagram, and important for us to know, we have seen that now this one is the optimal point, the point of optimal efficiency, where we have an equilibrium that is generating a corresponding optimal price there, and then also the corresponding optimal output QS naught, optimal output, optimal amount of pollution QS naught. And then we have another equilibrium there, that is actually representing the actual price in the market, the actual price of these goods and service, the goods are produced by this polluting farm, and the actual amount of pollution, for example, if it's carbon dioxide that is emitted into the atmosphere, What do we realize? We realize that the actual amount of pollution is greater, the actual amount of pollution here, which is QE, is greater. It is in front of the QS naught. It is greater than the optimal amount of pollution that is required, which is QS naught. So in that perspective, that's why we conclude that negative externalities are always oversupplied. They are always oversupplied in the market. They're always oversupplied in the market. Yeah, and then we have this section here of a triangle. That section, there is that section there that looks like a triangle, which I can shade there like that. That area there is the external cost. The external cost, in other words, the inconvenience that the inconvenience of the pollution that the society faces from this polluting farm, the inconvenience that the society faces maybe by inhaling in this carbon dioxide, for example, right? So which is called the external cost, the external cost. So I hope we are together up to that level. If we are not together, please feel free to ask. So that was a negative externality of production. Now I want to explain now here at this very point. We shall be looking, of course, at the measures, how the government internalizes these negative externalities. But now I want to use this very curve to explain how the government, and now we are having a negative externality of production, where now we are seeing a situation or a scenario where this polluting farm is emitting these greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, they are harmful to people's health. So it literally means that this polluting industry, it is making money, it is producing goods and making money, but at the expense of the environment, at the expense of people nearby inhaling in these greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, which in the long run will be harmful to their health. You may find that some of these people develop diseases like lung cancer. So that is an external cost. Are we together? That is an external cost. So who is liable to who is liable to these people getting these lung diseases? So the government, so that will be a market failure. And how is this pollution now a market failure? It is a market failure because the market has not attached, the market has failed to attach a price on this pollution. The market has failed to be accountable for this pollution, which is harming the environment, which is harming the health of the nearby people in that area near the factory. So that will be a market failure. Now, and why is it a market failure? Because we are having excess pollution, excess amount of pollution than the optimal, than the required amount of pollution into the atmosphere. So at the end of the day, that is a market failure, and the government has to come in. When we have micro market failures like externalities, in this perspective, a negative externality, the government comes in. The government comes in and internalizes. Libra is saying, excuse me, madam, what do you mean by common access resources? Now we shall get there. There is no use of us being inquisitive. We shall get there, right? We are going to look at all of them, but I want to explain one by one. Are we together? I want to explain one concept by one cause. We have causes of market failure. We shall be getting there, right? So we are now looking at an externality, which is number one. Are we together? Which is market failure number one. We shall get there to common access resources. Now, I was saying that I think now we know what the meaning of a negative externality in production means, polluting industry. Now, what is the government going to do with this pollution that is not accounted for, that has not been attached, given a price by the market? The government comes in to internalize this negative externality, and it has to make sure that it reduces the amount of pollution. It has to make sure that it reduces the amount of pollution by this polluting farm. And how is it going to reduce the amount of pollution? The logic is simple. The government is going to impose a tax on this polluting farm. The government is going to impose a tax. Remember, because the negative externality of the pollution is not accounted for, it is not, there is no price attached to it by the market. So the government has to attach a price by taxing. Are we together? Taxes the polluting farm, and the taxation at the end of the day will increase. At the end of the day, this factory will end up now increasing the price of the product sold. The product sold here, and the taxation by the government will result into increase in the prices sold by, in the prices of the goods sold by this polluting factory. And what happens when there is increase in the price of the goods? Remember, with the law of demand, we say that the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus, or keeping other factors constant. So this tax, in a way, it is going to lead to increase in the price of the goods sold by this polluting farm. And when the price increases, of course, according to the law of demand, the quantity will reduce. But this one will be the amount, the quantity of pollution. The amount of pollution will reduce. Now, this kind of tax that the government imposes is what we call a Pigouvian tax. A Pigouvian tax, or simply what we call a corrective tax. A Pigouvian tax, a Pigouvian tax, or a corrective tax. Now, it is called a Pigouvian tax because after its founder, Arthur Pigou, Professor Arthur Pigou in 1920, who introduced the Pigouvian tax. And according to him, he said that a Pigouvian tax is a tax that is imposed on every unit of output produced by the farm. A Pigouvian tax is a tax imposed on each unit of output produced by the farm. In this case, it will be produced by the polluting farm in this particular kind of example. So as the tax is imposed on each unit of output, which we call a Pigouvian tax or corrective tax, Pigouvian tax after its founder, Professor Arthur Pigou in 1920, it is going to reduce the amount. Of course, the lower the amount of output produced, the lower the amount of pollution, right? So one of the ways the government internalizes, the government solves that problem of pollution, which is a negative externality of production, is by imposing a Pigouvian tax, or what we call a corrective tax, with the instance of reducing the amount of output produced, and therefore, of course, when the farms a tax is imposed, the prices will increase, the cost of production increases, the output produced reduces, but at the same time, the amount of pollution reduces. So I hope we are together at that point, and I hope that we have understood what we mean by a negative externality of production, a negative externality of production. So that external cost is also called the welfare loss. That external cost is also called the welfare cost, and the welfare loss or the external cost. So the external cost or the welfare cost can be in the form of what we call in form of these greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming. Global warming is the increase, the continuous the rise in temperatures in the environment, the rising temperatures of the environment, of course, due to a number of factors like pollution, increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to increasing temperature levels in the atmosphere, in the long run, leading to what we call global warming. Then also there is this negative externality brings about air pollution. That is the welfare loss. The welfare loss, where we are having the marginal social cost greater than the marginal social benefit. We've already seen that this air pollution contributes to lung diseases and high cancer rates among the population that are inhaling these greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon dioxide, for example, sulfur dioxide, methane, and so on. Then this pollution can end up into the water, leading to water pollution, which destroys the fish stocks, the marine organisms. Then also this air pollution can end up in the soil, that leads to soil contamination, at the end of the day harming agricultural productivity. So all that is what we call the external cost or the welfare loss that is brought about by the negative externality of production, and in this perspective, pollution, air pollution. So I hope we are together up to that level. Let us look at negative externality of consumption. Negative externality of consumption. Negative externality of consumption. Now, important for us to note, now we are seeing that this diagram, this graph or the curve is now different from the other. Remember, the other one has been externality in production, but it was negative externality in production. Now, it is also important for us to know the logic of drawing an externality in consumption. An externality in consumption. As long as you see the word externality in consumption, yeah. Remember, the logic was that when it is a benefit, it's a demand curve. When it is a cost, it is the supply curve, right? So if it is a negative, if it is in consumption, yeah, in consumption, we know that when someone is consuming, they should benefit something, isn't it? When someone is consuming anything, there is a benefit that they get, isn't it? There is a benefit that they get out of consumption. Are we together? So because of that, because when someone is consuming something, they get a benefit, then it means we are going to have two demand curves. We are going to have two demand curves. We're going to have what? Two demand curves. Why? Because when you are consuming something, there is something you benefit. When you take a soda, for example, there is that benefit that you get. There is that satisfaction that you get. Are we together? So it has to be in the perspective of benefit. So because it's in the perspective of benefit, we are going to have two demand curves that are showing benefits from what you benefit from the consumption. Then the other curve will be a supply curve that will be representing the cost. That is for externality in consumption. That is externality in what? In consumption. So this one will be, now what you have to know that if it is, after you have known how you generate an externality in consumption, then you have to know, is it a negative externality or a positive externality? Now we know that it is a negative externality, but it is important for us to know that with a negative externality in consumption, yeah, maybe let me first give an example. With a negative externality in consumption, we have a cigarette market. A cigarette what? Market. For example, BAT. Yeah, you know BAT, British American Tobacco. That is under the cigarette what? Market. This selling cigarettes, yeah? A factory that manufactures cigarettes. That is a cigarette market. So we have to know that if it is a negative externality in consumption, the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. The marginal private benefit. The marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. The marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. Now let's get another example of someone who is smoking. Someone who goes to the shop, buys a cigarette, or the cigarette stick, goes, buys this cigarette and begins smoking it in the what? Maybe in a taxi, in a public place. So of course, as this person is smoking this cigarette, they are getting a benefit. There is a private benefit they are getting as an individual, right? But that private benefit will be greater than the marginal social benefit. In other words, that the society here, the indirect meaning is that here, the people, for example, in the public, the people in this public taxi, public means of transport, the person is smoking in a taxi, for example, but it means that these people in a taxi are inhaling in the smoke, and literally they are passive smokers. So literally they are not even benefiting anything. So at the end of the day, we can either say that the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit, or we can say that the marginal private benefit is greater. It is only this person that is smoking that is getting a benefit, but the people that are inhaling in the smoke, for them, they are suffering the consequence, which is we call the external cost, the external cost. Now, after knowing that this is the marginal, we know that now that with a negative externality, you should be noting down these things. We know now that a negative externality in consumption, the marginal private benefit, the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social cost. The marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. Sorry, the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. Number two, that is number 1 point to note. Number 2, with the negative externality in consumption, all of them are, of course, equilibrium. With all these externalities, equilibrium is obtained. Equilibrium is obtained at the point where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. Equilibrium is obtained at the point where the marginal, for all of them, all the externalities, equilibrium is obtained at the point where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So if you know that this one is the marginal social benefit, you've already known that this is the marginal social benefit, then it means now the corresponding supply curve, the corresponding supply curve will be representing the cost, and in this perspective, the marginal social cost. In this perspective, the marginal social cost. Now, we have to look at the equilibrium. We have to determine the equilibrium point. The equilibrium point will be at the point where marginal social cost, this blue supply curve here, meets this red supply curve here, which is the marginal social benefit. So that will be a point of equilibrium. That will be a point of equilibrium. Are we together? That will be a point of equilibrium. And at that point, we obtain what we call the optimal price, the optimal price. And we shall also be getting a corresponding optimal output, or the optimal amount of pollution, which we call QS0. And here, at the point of intersection, it will be an equilibrium here, which we can call equilibrium knot, and at that point of equilibrium, where the marginal social cost curve meets the marginal social benefit curve, it will be the point of optimal efficiency. This point here, it is the point of optimal efficiency, the point of optimal mix of resources, optimal, or what we call allocative efficiency, the point of allocative efficiency, the point of allocative efficiency. And then, of course, now we have another equilibrium, the second equilibrium that is not optimal, the point of optimal efficiency, but rather that equilibrium will be showing the actual amount of, it will be corresponding to the actual price charged in the market, the actual price of the cigarettes in the cigarette market, the actual price of the cigarettes in the cigarette market, PE, and it will be corresponding to the actual the actual amount of output, the actual amount of output produced in the cigarette market, the actual amount of output produced in the cigarette market. Now, we realize that now the actual amount of cigarettes, for example, the actual amount of cigarettes produced is which is QE, is greater than the actual amount of cigarettes that should be produced in the market. So at the end of the day, we realize now that the actual amount QE of the cigarettes here, for example, of the cigarettes that should be produced in the market is greater than the optimal amount, the equilibrium amount of cigarettes that should be produced by the cigarette market. So of course, at the end of the day, we now know point three is that negative externalities are always oversupplied in the market. Point three to note for us here when we are drawing these curves is that negative externalities are always oversupplied or overallocated, oversupplied in the market or overallocated in the market. And that's why we see that QE, the actual amount of cigarettes produced here by the cigarette market, is greater. It is above the optimal amount of cigarettes that should be produced by the cigarette market, which is QS naught. And so it means the amount, there is oversupply of the cigarettes here from the cigarette market. And as a result, we are going to have a negative externality of consumption because, of course, the more the cigarettes, the more people take these cigarettes and the more we are going to have complications like lung diseases, what we call external cost or the welfare loss, external cost or the welfare loss. So the government, this is a negative externality in consumption. The government uses the same measure of internalizing these negative externalities, whether consumption or in production. So the logic is the same. The government is going to impose a tax on this cigarette market. The government is still going to impose a tax. In this case, it will be a corrective tax. It will be a corrective tax that we've already looked at. And this corrective tax, at the end of the day, it will lead to this cigarette market to increase the price of the goods that are being manufactured. Of course, the price of cigarettes, and when the price of cigarettes increase, of course, at the end of the day, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded of the cigarettes will reduce. The quantity demanded of the cigarettes will reduce, and of course, they will reduce up to the level where we shall obtain an optimal amount of cigarettes that are supposed to be manufactured by this cigarette market, for example, BAT, British American Tobacco. So that is one measure that the government uses to internalize what we call negative externalities. It could be a negative externality in production. It could be a negative externality in consumption. It could be a negative externality in consumption. Now, let us look at how the government responds to the negative externalities. We've already looked at the negative, what we mean by the negative externality. We've already looked at what we mean by the negative externalities in production and in consumption. So we've already looked at one way the government responds or internalizes negative externality. It imposes a corrective tax that we saw is also known as a Pigouvian tax. The government can also use what we call regulations or legislation. These are basically laws that limit the quantity of a good produced or require these polluting farms to produce, to manufacture in an environmentally friendly way, friendly way. Of course, the essence of these laws is, for example, the government can instruct these polluting farms to use what we call pollution abatement equipment. And with the pollution abatement equipment, it will simply be the kind of equipment that these polluting farms use to make sure that these greenhouse gas emissions, for example, the carbon dioxide, are filtered. Yeah, they are filtered, for example, before they are emitted into the atmosphere. Atmosphere. Then the government can also use what we call banning. It can ban the production or the manufacture of dangerous drugs. For example, it can ban drinking among minors, of course, alcohol. It can ban the manufacture of narcotics, nicotine. For example, cigarettes have that chemical called nicotine, which is harmful to people's health. It can ban the production of automatic weapons, right? So all those ones, the government can bring. Banning is bringing to an end or not accepting manufacture of certain products. Then the government can also internalize negative externalities by using tradable permits. The government can use what we call tradable permits that are also called licenses, tradable permits or licenses. So the tradable permits, they work in the same way the licenses work. The tradable permits work in the same way the licenses work. Of course, if the government sees that an upcoming factory or farm will be harmful, will be polluting, and it will be harmful to the pollution will be harmful to the environment. It does not meet the required, it's not abiding by the required standards, environmental standards, then the government will not issue a license or a tradable permit to these. So in this perspective, the government is a monopoly. The government has an autonomy in the provision of these licenses or the tradable permits to these farms, to these polluting farms. The government, for example, can reduce the amount of tradable permits issued out simply, for example, to reduce the amount of pollution, the amount of pollution by these polluting farms. So that's how the government deals with or internalizes negative externalities. So we've already looked at the polluting industry, and I've already explained how the government uses the corrective taxes. And we've seen the corrective tax is also known as the Pigouvian tax that was propounded by Professor Arthur Pigou in 1920, right? So we've already looked at that. And let us look at the evaluation of corrective taxes. The evaluation of corrective taxes. In other words, we are looking at what are the consequences after the government has used the corrective taxes to internalize or to respond to these negative externalities. How is it going to affect the consumers? How is it going to affect the consumers? What will be the impact here? What will be the consequences? Let us look at the consequences of this corrective tax we are evaluating. So it will lead, these corrective taxes will lead, of course, to higher cost of production. It will become now costly for these farms to produce. And of course, when it comes costly, at the end of the day, this is not good for business. The amount of output, of course, will reduce. And then high prices for consumers. Of course, now we've seen that the taxes imposed, these corrective taxes imposed by the government, will be reflected. They will reflect through high prices that these producers will be imposing for the consumers. So at the end of the day, the consumers, the high taxes are being felt. It is the consumers that are feeling the tax burden, that are suffering the tax burden, because the taxes lead to high prices of these goods that are produced by these polluting farms, for example. Then, of course, because of the high cost of production, we see that at the end of the day, these farms may end up laying off some workers. Yeah, laying off some workers, because it will be costly. The cost of production will have increased for them. And so we may find some farms laying off some workers just to survive and be able to celebrate their next anniversary as businesses. So you find some workers laid off. Why? Because the cost of production has reduced as a result of the corrective taxes imposed. We shall see that these corrective taxes will lead to loss of competitiveness in the global market. They will lead to loss of competitiveness in the global market, right? So you may find that here other governments in other nations are not imposing these corrective taxes, and where in these nations where these governments are not, their governments are not imposing corrective taxes, of course they'll have a competitive advantage in the global market compared to these farms where their governments are imposing corrective taxes that will find it costly for them to compete in the global market. When we talk about the global market, we are basically talking about international trade. Let us look at tradable permits. Let us look at tradable permits. Now, we've already seen that the government, how the government internalizes these negative externalities, how the government internalizes these negative externalities. One of them, we've seen that one of the measures, taxes, corrective taxes. We've seen now, we are now looking at tradable permits, yeah? Of course, we saw laws and regulations. We saw the government can ban production of certain narcotics that are harmful to the people's health. We are now looking at tradable permits, which work synonymously with licenses. So with the tradable permits, they are called tradable permits because they can be sold among these polluting farms. These permits, they are called tradable permits because they can be sold amongst these polluting farms. So here with this kind of curve now here, we realize that, for example, that this supply curve here that you see, it is inelastic in nature. It is actually perfectly inelastic in nature. And someone may be asking me that, Madam, but you have always told us that, not told us, but we have always known that a supply curve, that's not the shape of the supply curve. Perfectly inelastic. That is a perfectly inelastic supply curve. A perfectly inelastic. Remember in our microeconomics class, when we were looking at, for those of us that have done microeconomics, when we are looking at the measures of elasticity, we saw, for example, perfectly inelastic, right? So that is a perfectly inelastic supply curve. Someone, I know now someone is asking, but madam, we've already been taught, for us, what we know is that a supply curve is supposed to be upward sloping like that. And the demand curve is supposed to be that downward sloping, right? But of course, we saw the exceptions of the law of demand. We saw, yeah, that it's not always in that perspective. Of course, though, that is the normal supply curve, the normal demand curve. But there are scenarios that change the shape of that curve. Are we together? So it's not this other normal supply curve that you know, which you have already, which we look at. That is the supply curve. It is upward sloping, explaining the law of supply. Yes, of course, we know that even in the measures of elasticity, we have what we call inelastic supply, where we see that that curve will be vertical with perfectly inelastic supply curve. It will be vertical in nature. So here, the vertical element of this supply curve means that the government here is now a monopoly. The government is a monopoly in the supply of tradable permits or the supply of licenses. The government is a monopoly in the supply of licenses or tradable permits. So initially, if we see that, for example, in 2012, the supply curve for tradable permits, this is for tradable permits, was, for example, this green supply curve here. And what the government does now, if it wants to reduce the amount of pollution, it will reduce the amount, the quantity. It will reduce the quantity of, or the number of tradable permits that are issued out to these polluting farms. And the reduction here is shown by this arrow that is shifting inwards or to the left, shown by this arrow that is shifting inwards or to the left, right? So we are seeing this supply curve now, which was in 2012. Now here, if it is 2020 or 2021, it has now shifting, reducing. Literally here, the government has reduced the number of tradable permits or licenses that are being issued out to these polluting farms. So of course, reducing the amount of a number of permits reduces the amount of pollution. It reduces the amount of pollution. If there are few polluting farms, the less the amount of pollution. So of course now we know that at the end of the day, it will not, at the end of the day, remember that since these tradable permits, they are called tradable permits because they can be, these polluting farms can sell these tradable permits among themselves. For example, if a polluting farm sees that now it is becoming costly for it, it's becoming costly for it to continue with business, and it is exiting, it will sell its tradable permit to another farm that has remained in the industry, to another polluting farm that has remained in the industry. It will sell its tradable permits. So that's why they are called tradable permits, right? So now we realize that now, of course, when the government reduces the amount of permits that are sold, that the amount of permits that are issued to these polluting farms, at the end of the day, we are going to have the price of these tradable permits increasing. We shall have the price of these tradable permits increasing. We are going to have the price we are going to have the price of the tradable permits increasing. The reduction in supply of tradable permits by the government leads to the increase in the price of tradable permits. And of course, this becomes costly for the polluting farms, and some of them will be exiting the industry, getting out of business, yeah, which at the end of the day will help reduce the amount of pollution, right? Then you also have environmentalists. We've seen these environmentalists that agitate against these polluting farms to protect the environment. So even these environmentalists, they can buy these tradable permits. They can buy these tradable permits, by the way, with the essence of discouraging and eliminating these polluting farms, with the essence of eliminating these polluting farms. At the end of the day, to have the environment protected, to have the environment protected. Remember, in our very first session, we saw the difference between environmentalists and ecologists. We saw the difference between environmental economics and ecological economics. And just a recap, we saw that environmentalists or environmental economics, for it is more to do with the human beings. It is more focused on protecting the health, for example, the health of human beings. But for ecological economics, it looks at basically the center of its analysis. It is at the center of natural resources. And we saw that environmental economics, for it attaches a monetary value on the natural resources, whereas ecological economics does not look at the monetary value, but rather it looks at the value of natural resources in terms of inherent values like the right of wildlife to live, their justice to live, right? So I want us to stop here unless there is any question concerning what we covered in this session.